Good day. The last 24 hours in the crisis over Ukraine, the global crisis as it has now become, give further insight into the extent to which Western governments and Western officials are now completely at sea, completely unable to come up with coherent responses to this crisis, which they have themselves to a great extent unleashed. Let's first of all deal with the immediate situation in Ukraine. It's not going to take us very long. Firstly, the Russians yesterday announced a humanitarian corridor from the Azot chemical factory in Severodonetsk to allow the civilians there to leave and to go elsewhere to the territory controlled by the Lugansk People's Republic. Entirely unsurprisingly, and following the pattern that was established during the siege of the Azovstal steelworks, very few civilians left the chemical factory and availed themselves of the opportunity to use this humanitarian corridor, if any of them in fact did. The pattern at the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol was that the military, the Ukrainian troops stationed in the Azovstal steelworks were very reluctant, or appeared to be very reluctant, to allow the civilians to leave the factory, partly because that apparently exposed them to attack by the Russian military. And the result was that this situation at the Azovstal steelworks dragged on for weeks until eventually the civilians were enabled to leave through the intervention of the UN's humanitarian agencies, following which resistance collapsed. It looks as if the identical pattern is going to repeat itself at the Azot chemical works in Lysychansk. Now, this is unsurprising. As I said, it's the pattern that we've seen before, and I don't know how long this process will continue for, but it will certainly continue for significantly longer than the couple of days that I was perhaps expecting over-optimistically in my previous video. I should say, and as various people have pointed out to me, that I seriously underestimated the number of Ukrainian troops in the Azot chemical works. I initially thought that there were a couple of hundred of them. That was based on information provided by officials of the Lugansk People's Republic. It now seems that there are certainly well over 1,000 Ukrainian troops at the Azot chemical works, perhaps more than that. In other words, this is a significant force that has now been surrounded and which is under pressure to surrender. Now, it's not had the time, the Ukrainians have not had the time to prepare the Azot chemical works for a prolonged siege in the way that was possible with the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. There aren't apparently the enormous supplies of food and water and ammunition in the Azot chemical works that there were in the Azovstal steelworks. So even though it looks as if this process of achieving both the evacuation of the civilians in the chemical works and the surrender of the Ukrainian troops there is going to take a little longer than I anticipated, I still don't think it is going to take as long as it took with the Ukrainian soldiers in the Azovstal steelworks. So we shall see how things turn out. There is something else, by the way, which I said in my previous video, which I do want to correct. Now, I said in that previous video that the Ukrainians have now admitted that they can only launch around 5,000 rounds of ammunition a day. That came from Ukrainian sources, and this compares with the 400,000 to 500,000 rounds of ammunition, of artillery ammunition that the Russians use in Donbass every day. Now, that figure of 4 to 500,000 has always seemed to me very high, but it is a figure that I've seen repeated in various places, and I'd assume, therefore, I'd come to assume that it was true. Well, a senior Ukrainian official, one of Zelensky's spokesmen, has actually said that the Russians, in fact, launch around 70,000 rounds of ammunition in Donbass on any particular day. Now, that does seem to me a more plausible figure than the 4 to 500,000 that others have been repeating, and I'm going to stick with that figure of 70,000 rounds of ammunition launched by the Russians in Donbass every day. I would say that the 4 to 500,000 rounds a day figure that I've been hearing is supposed to cover not just the entire front, not just Donbass, or the entire front line, which is around 1,000 kilometers long, but in fact the entirety of Ukraine. So 70,000 applies only to Donbass and is of course a Ukrainian figure. And of course it doesn't apply to the entire front line or the entire war. But having said that, most of the fighting, the most intense fighting, is in Donbass, and I'm guessing that this figure of 70,000 rounds in a day that the Russians are allegedly firing in Donbass accounts for the bulk of the rounds of ammunition that the Russians launch in any particular day. Let's round it off and guess that across the entirety of Ukraine, the Russians fire perhaps 100,000 rounds a day. That's still 20 times more than the Ukrainians do. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. I can't confirm these figures about the rounds of ammunition that the Russians launch every day, but the figure of 70 to 100,000 rounds a day, 70,000 for Donbass, 100,000 for the entirety of Ukraine, that does seem to me rather more plausible than that figure of 4 to 500,000 rounds a day that has been bandied around before and which I myself had repeated before. Anyway, that just clarifies a number of points that I've made in previous videos. It corrects those points, with supplemental information that has come through. And, it's important that one updates and clarifies what one is saying based on the information that comes through. Anyway, there's been another breakthrough by the Russians in another part of Donbass. An important town called Vrubovka has apparently now been captured by the Russians. This has left yet another Ukrainian force apparently encircled. We're now seeing more and more of these cauldrons appearing across Donbass. Ukrainian troops cut off from each other, cut off from any prospect of resupply. And it's inevitable, it seems to me, that at some point over the next few weeks, all of these various groups of Ukrainians surrounded in various places in cauldrons. We have one in Severodonetsk at the Azot Chemical Works. We have a number of others in various other places, and yet another one has just been created following the fall of Vrubovka. All of these cauldrons or mini cauldrons will probably start to collapse one after the other, and we will no doubt see within the next week, 2 weeks, perhaps longer, it seems to me, an inevitable overall collapse of the Ukrainian position in northern Donbass. It now looks like it's only a matter of time. And in the meantime, I should say that the Russians also seem to be very close now to Slavyansk. I said yesterday in my previous video that Russian artillery is now apparently shelling Slavyansk. One hears that they're advancing ever more closely on Slavyansk itself, and it looks as if the Ukrainian troops in Slavyansk are going to be surrounded as well. And I suspect that things are going to take a rather similar form to what they've done in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation. The Russians have encircled Severodonetsk, cutting it off from Lysychansk. They're going to clear out Severodonetsk before they move on to take over Lysychansk. And I suspect they're going to do the same with the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. They're going to surround and force the capitulation of the Ukrainian force in Slavyansk, and only then will they move on to the rather bigger Ukrainian force, which is now located in Kramatorsk. Lastly, there's been some reports, I'm talking about Donbass now, there's been some reports that the Donbass, the Donetsk militia defending Donetsk city, which was heavily shelled 2 days ago, as I discussed in my previous video, that the Donbass militia, the Donetsk militia, is now receiving some sort of reinforcement from Russia. And the suggestions that I've heard is that they're going to be provided with Iskander missile launchers. Presumably those will be controlled by the Russian military themselves. And the intention apparently is to use these launchers to launch multiple missile strikes on these Ukrainian artillery formations that have been shelling Donetsk. Well, we'll see or hear more about that. And last but not least, in this roundup of military news, we hear that there's been more advances by the Russians ever closer to Kharkiv city. Apparently, there's been more settlements and villages previously under Russian control, then briefly recaptured by the Ukrainians, now in the process of being recaptured again by the Russians. The Russians are basically back at the starting lines of a few weeks ago. They're now very close to Kharkiv city again. The fact, by the way, that the Russians have decided to act to reverse the Ukrainian gains around Kharkiv city, those Ukrainian gains that took place in that much touted Kharkiv counteroffensive of a few weeks ago, that strongly suggests to me that the Russians do have some ultimate intentions with respect to Kharkiv city. I'm sure that will come as a surprise to very few people, but if the Russians were not interested in Kharkiv city, well, I don't see why they would be interested in recovering this territory that they had previously retreated from. Anyway, those are the major military developments. There have been some political statements. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, a person who many people believe will be Lavrov's eventual successor as Russian Foreign Minister, has made some comments about the position of Russia with respect to negotiations and about the general progress of the military operation. He appeared to say that the military operation is proceeding according to plan, that the Russians continue with all the objectives they set themselves at the outset of that operation, and that they and they alone will decide when those objectives have been achieved. He also said, Ryabkov also said, that whilst Russia is open to negotiation with Ukraine, it doesn't require such negotiations. It's prepared to continue its operation until it achieves its objectives, even if no negotiations take place. And Ryabkov again criticized Zelensky and his government for the fact that the negotiations, which seemed briefly to be going in a promising direction in March, that those negotiations are effectively at a standstill. So that is an uncompromising message from the Russians. It suggests that they have all but given up any expectation of negotiations with Ukraine, that they maintain fully all their objectives, that they're going to pursue those objectives, and that it is they and they alone who will decide when the military operation ends. That's a pretty uncompromising set of statements from Ryabkov, and one which anyone who still entertains hopes of a negotiated solution to the Ukrainian conflict, should pay particular heed to. I think that the Russians have looked at the military situation in Ukraine. They feel that things are going very much their way. They've come to the view, which I think is now becoming shared by more and more people, that Ukraine's military forces are dwindling away, that they're losing artillery, that they're losing ammunition, that they're losing trained cadres, that they may not be able to sustain the war for very much longer. And I think that the Russians have also concluded that all the talk about Western aid to Ukraine amounts to nothing, or at least to very little, that it's not going to change the military situation in any substantial or significant way. I would also say that I've seen a report which claims, and this I cannot confirm, but which claims that the Pentagon is becoming increasingly disenchanted by Ukraine's tactics in the battle in Donbass. Now, I want to repeat again, I've not actually seen this report itself. I've heard about it from third parties, and that always makes me a little skeptical. But if the Pentagon is indeed beginning to become concerned that the Ukrainians are fighting this war in an unwise way, well, they're only saying, the Pentagon would only be thinking what I know an awful lot of other people are thinking, that this stand and fight policy that Ukraine has been pursuing in Donbass has been a serious error, and that it's leading Ukraine's military to, frankly, a catastrophic outcome. And if the Pentagon, at least the uniformed military in the Pentagon, are coming to that conclusion, then I wonder whether that will make them less enthusiastic about sending more weapon systems to Ukraine. They must be worried, increasingly worried, that all that will happen is that if those weapon systems are sent to Ukraine, more of them will fall into Russian hands. And of course, there's now growing evidence that more and more of them also are appearing in the black market, where they're being sold, presumably by Ukrainians, in the black market, in all kinds of ways which would not be, shall we say, in the interests of the United States. Anyway, I want to stress again, I've not seen that report. I'm not sure that this is indeed what the Pentagon is thinking, but the third parties who've reported this have up to now, I found, been reliable. Well, that's the situation, as I said, in the war. Now, there's been a lot of talk recently about recriminations, that there are increasing numbers of recriminations flying around, and that, as I said at the start of this program, there's clear signs that Western governments aren't sure of what to do. Well, let's start with the recriminations, because we're now starting to see more and more evidence of these. A couple of days ago, President Biden of the United States gave an interview in which he criticized President Zelensky of Ukraine, saying that President Zelensky had not heeded President Biden's warnings before the war that the Russians were intending to launch an attack on Ukraine. Now, this is ancient history. It relates to events that took place before the war began on the 24th of February. It is indeed the case that apparently, as I remember well, there were bitter arguments between Zelensky and Biden, but it does seem a strange thing for President Biden to bring up now when we are months away from those events and when Zelensky is supposed to have proved to be this heroic leader leading Ukraine in this heroic battle against the Russians. Why is President Biden bringing this topic up now? I can't help but think that partly the intention is to shift the blame for any debacle in Ukraine onto Zelensky. I can't really see what other purpose revisiting this topic has at this time. That's, if you like, recriminations from President Biden directing the blame at President Zelensky. Well, President Zelensky is also up to this game, and he has now made public comments which for the first time appear to confirm that there have been differences between him and the military commander of the Ukrainian military, General Zaluzhny. Now, there's been many reports about this up to now. I've been a little bit careful about these reports because they've been basically rumors. Some of them have seemed to be well sourced, but there's been very little in terms of open statements, and certainly none from the Ukrainian government that would actually lend credence to these claims of arguments and disputes at the very top of the Ukrainian leadership. Well, Zelensky has now said certain things which do suggest that he has issues with General Zaluzhny. Firstly, he's talked about General Zaluzhny providing beautiful reports. Beautiful, one feels, ought to be in inverted commas. It's an odd choice of words. And Zelensky, in responding to various complaints made by Ukrainian soldiers and their families about the conduct of the war and about the way in which Ukrainian soldiers have been suffering from shortages of supplies, he appeared to direct them to General Zaluzhny as the person ultimately responsible, which I have to say did seem to me a way of shifting the blame from Zelensky himself onto Zaluzhny. Well, maybe I'm reading too much into this exchange, into these words, but certainly that's how it appeared to me. So we've had Biden criticizing Zelensky, and Zelensky in turn criticizing Zaluzhny. Okay, that's all perhaps unsurprising at this stage in the war, but now it gets really bizarre. And this is where we come to the kind of things that Western leaders are saying. First of all, we've had some really extraordinary statements from the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg. Stoltenberg has said that there was no reason to think that any NATO country would object to Finland's and Sweden's entry into NATO, which is in effect an admission by Jens Stoltenberg that he didn't engage in any consultations and that the Turkish objections took him by surprise. Now, I have to say, I find that absolutely bizarre. After all, one would have thought that that is Jens Stoltenberg's job. That, having new countries joining NATO, countries like Finland and Sweden, is a pretty immense thing, or so one would have imagined, and one would have expected that the Secretary General of NATO would, before green-lighting applications from Finland and Sweden, that he would have actually gone out and checked with various countries, the various NATO countries, to make sure that there would not be any objections if Finland and Sweden made those applications. And again, I can't help but think that Stoltenberg is responding here to criticisms. Public criticisms which have been made on the margins, but I suspect private criticisms which have been made at much greater length by other people. People are probably coming round and saying to Stoltenberg, how did we ever get into this mess? How is it that Sweden and Finland were led up the garden path, making applications for NATO membership, and nobody thought of the possibility that President Erdogan of Turkey might have objections? And it does look to me as if there have been recriminations behind the scenes about this, and Stoltenberg is in part defending himself, and of course he's implicitly blaming President Erdogan of Turkey for the whole problem. So that's one set of recriminations on top of the ones that I've just been saying. But now it gets weirder still, because we see how in the United States, President Biden has now been going around telling everybody that the increases in inflation, the energy increase, the increases in energy prices, the increases in food prices are all the work of President Putin of Russia. He talks about Putin's price hikes. And most incredibly, we now learn that he's written a letter to the heads of the US oil and energy companies, essentially accusing them of doing insufficient to try to resolve the problems created by Putin's price hike. And he said that the United States government would use all the tools at its disposal to see that this problem of increased energy costs was resolved. And I have to say, the wording that was made in this letter, that was used in this letter to the energy companies, that did seem to me to have almost an air of threat about it. Now, this is particularly strange because I can remember in the run-up to the war, the energy companies, when they were consulted about the possibility of sanctions on Russia, or energy sanctions being imposed on Russia, going around and warning the administration that this would be a very unwise thing to do, because the market in energy was extremely tight, and it would simply not be possible to replace Russian oil and Russian gas if sanctions were imposed upon them. And the administration and European governments ignored all of that. President Biden imposed an oil ban on imports of Russian oil. The European Union has essentially done the same thing. And, well, here we see how, after ignoring the advice given by the oil and energy companies, he's now turning and criticizing the oil and energy companies because that very thing which they warned about has actually happened. And that does seem most extraordinary, but frankly very typical of the way in which this administration conducts itself. And I would say that the reality is that the United States, it seems, is importing Russian oil, though it's doing so from third parties. And it seems that the administration has now been giving advice to the US agro-industrial complex to ramp up imports of Russian fertilizer products. In other words, the US government is quietly undermining its own embargo, its own ban on Russian oil imports, and of course it's facilitating Russian exports of fertilizer. Well, that's President Biden. He's blaming the oil companies because after disregarding their advice, the thing they warned against has happened. But it gets even stranger, and now we must move to Europe, because we've heard that the supply of oil, of gas to Europe has actually fallen. There's been a reduction in the amount of gas that the Russians are sending via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And the Russians say that this is for technical reasons, because Siemens, the German company, has not completed repairs on certain transformers, some certain products or components of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. That may or may not be true. The German government has responded that these reductions in Russian exports of natural gas are political, and they are talking about Russian energy blackmail. Well, I don't know where the truth is, but for the purpose of this program, I'm going to run with the German explanation that it is in fact a decision by the Russians to gradually, slowly dial down gas exports to Europe. Why are the Germans surprised? Why are they angry? After all, what has the European Union, what has Germany been doing? They've been imposing sanctions on Russia. They've been taking steps to try to inflict damage on the Russian economy. Is it really surprising in that kind of an economic war that the Russians may be retaliating in kind? I mean, wasn't this something that perhaps ought to have been anticipated? It does seem rather astonishing, indeed even bizarre, that European leaders, European governments seem to think that, it's perfectly fine for them to impose sanctions on other countries, to inflict economic harm on those other countries, but that it is somehow outrageous, somehow absolutely wrong, in some way blackmail, when those other countries retaliate by imposing their own sanctions and their own economic measures against the European governments that are sanctioning them. It's very strange to hear this tone of injured anger and almost lèse-majesté that European governments are adopting as the amount of gas that's flowing from Russia to Europe is ever so gradually, perhaps even not so gradually, starting to get dialed down. And it's clear to me that they have no real plan, no real idea of what to do. Talk about increasing liquefied natural gas imports from the United States, from Qatar. Well, that has gone already as far as it can, and it's nowhere near enough, as the energy industry warned European governments would be the case. And of course, there's problems now operating Gazprom Germania, the German subsidiary of Gazprom, which the German government seized some weeks ago. They're finding that it's becoming extremely difficult to operate it because, well, this is a Gazprom subsidiary and the Russians know how to operate it and operate it properly, and the Germans don't, and it's costing the Germans 10 billion euros to do so. They have to bail this subsidiary out to the tune of 10 billion euros, and the costs are already clocking up, they're mounting up, and again, they don't really fully know what to do. And again, one gets the sense that they are at something of a loss on what to do about all of this. But then it gets stranger still, because we've now had this extraordinary series of increasingly bizarre decisions by the European Central Bank. European governments came together, launched this economic war against Russia. As we discussed on the Duran, as I've discussed on this channel, the inevitable result is that prices of primary products of food and energy have risen. This on top of an already high rate of inflation caused by the reckless overspending by the US administration following the 2021 inauguration of the new administration, which has caused the US economy to overheat, resulting in a inflationary surge which is becoming global. So we already had high rates of inflation because of those policies pursued by the US administration. And of course, the Europeans and the Americans have gone ahead and made that inflation problem much worse by engaging the Russians in this extraordinary economic war. And that is now creating problems because, of course, the classical way in which central banks deal with an inflation crisis is that they raise interest rates. They raise interest rates. That drains demand from the economy. Demand reduces. That causes prices to fall. That brings inflation down. Except raising interest rates in the Eurozone is proving extremely difficult because the biggest debtors in the Eurozone are certain European governments, particularly the governments of Southern Europe. The biggest debtor of all is Italy, but there are other governments like the one in Greece, which are in extremely difficult financial straits, and they've been able to tinker along, to trundle along over the last few years because the European Central Bank has kept interest rates not just low, but actually in negative territory. And it has been buying government bonds issued by South European governments, Italy, Greece. It's been buying those bonds via its own type of QE. But of course, it's not compatible to keep interest rates at these levels or to continue to pour money into your economy at a time when inflation is rising. So the European Central Bank, led by Christine Lagarde, hardly a person who inspires a great deal of economic confidence anyway, but somebody who is a loyal adherent of Eurozone policies, and especially someone who follows French and Italian directives very closely and interests very closely. So somebody who's been very keen on soaking up bonds and debt in Southern Europe, which is why she's been keen to pursue these QE and very low interest rate policies. Anyway, she is dithered about unwinding QE in the Eurozone and about raising interest rates. But with inflation rising, with problems in Northern Europe growing, with demand for higher interest rates in Northern Europe increasing, she's now caught in a trap. Does she raise interest rates and end QE, which could be a disaster for Southern Europe, or does she follow the example of the Bank of Japan, persist with low interest rates, persist with QE, in which case the euro will collapse, as the Japanese yen is currently doing, which could of course increase inflation in the Eurozone even more. So what does Lagarde do? Well, she has been edging over the last few weeks at German insistence towards a policy of gradually unwinding QE and raising interest rates. But this, of course, has created problems because investors are becoming increasingly unwilling to buy bonds in Southern Europe, government bonds issued by Southern European governments, Italy, Greece, or the others, because they are no longer confident of the backstop that the European Central Bank will also be buying them. And the result is that yields on Italian bonds especially have been rising, and there's now a difference, an increasing difference between yields for Italian bonds and bonds issued by the German government. And this points to a potential debt crisis in Southern Europe, which would be a catastrophic rerun at far more elevated levels of the debt crisis that hit Southern Europe in around a decade ago. So what does Lagarde do? Well, today, the day that I've called making this video, she called a meeting an emergency meeting of the European Central Bank. And everybody was waiting with anticipation as to what this meeting would do. Would it reverse the policy? Would it announce that QE will continue? Would it, as some people mischievously suggested, announce an even further reduction of interest rates into even deeper negative territory? Or would it announce, would the European Central Bank say that, problems of Southern Europe notwithstanding, the inflation problem is now so acute that they have no choice but to raise interest rates and to unwind QE? Well, the result of this meeting was that absolutely nothing happened. The meeting lasted for a very short time, and we had an announcement that the European Central Bank is going to try and find some other mechanism to buy bonds, which will not be done via QE. Now, what that mysterious new mechanism is, no one can say, and I doubt very much that such a mechanism actually exists. But there we go. Now, in his famous book about the Wall Street crash, the Canadian economist, J.K. Galbraith, once spoke about the no business meeting, a meeting at which no business is actually conducted. Christine Lagarde has, it seems to me, presided over exactly that sort of a meeting at the European Central Bank. A classic no business meeting. You bring everybody together, you bring them all into the same room. Christine Lagarde chairs, some kind of innocuous, anodyne statement is published, and everybody disperses and goes back to work. A no business meeting from the European Central Bank. Well, we shouldn't be too critical of Christine Lagarde in this situation, because European governments, the same European governments that are now worried about the situation with yields in Southern Europe, about a festering crisis in the Eurozone, a possible pending debt crisis in the Eurozone, caused by the overall inflation crisis. It's those same European governments which, after all, took those decisions to launch this economic war against Russia. And they were, of course, backed in doing that by the EU's other institutions, the European Commission and the European Parliament. They all enthusiastically, in fact, launched this economic war. They didn't really consult the European Central Bank before doing so. And of course, they now find themselves in a situation where the Eurozone is in a pending financial crisis, the Eurozone is in a pending debt crisis, and the European Central Bank self-evidently doesn't know what to do. A couple of days ago, I read out an article by Wolfgang Munchau, this important talking head, economics talking head in Germany and Britain, who talked about how the sanctions policy had not been thought through. Well, we now see the consequences. We see President Biden blaming the oil companies for policies that he himself has largely been the results of policies that he himself is largely the author of. We see a crisis in Europe. We see the Europeans, the Germans in particular, angry because the Russians are responding to the sanctions which were imposed on them, the oil bans and all the rest, by gradually dialing down gas exports. And we see everybody worried because the European Central Bank is struggling with this impossible dilemma. Does it raise interest rates or not? Does it end QE or not? All this at a time of very high inflation. All I can say is this: I've never known a time when Western governments have got things so badly wrong, when they have misjudged so catastrophically. They misjudged completely the military situation in Ukraine. They got carried away back in March with all sorts of strange ideas that because the Russians weren't storming Kiev, that Ukraine was winning the war. And now they find themselves completely unsure about what to do when it's becoming clear instead that Ukraine is losing the war. Do they escalate, dangerous though it is to do so, or do they draw back? Are they even in a position to escalate? Can they actually supply military aid to Ukraine that could turn this round? Most military analysts, in fact, I've actually read, at least those that I take seriously, say that they can't. And they've now found themselves in an economic situation that they never imagined they would find themselves in when they launched all those extraordinary decisions back in February, and which, had they taken a step back and thought through properly then, they surely would not have done. I come back and I repeat again that point which I have made so many times. Back in the past, the recent past, there was a way out of settling the Ukrainian crisis. That way out was implementing the Minsk II agreement, agreed in 2015, confirmed by a resolution of the UN Security Council, one voted for at the UN Security Council by Germany, Britain, by the United States, Britain and France, and of course also endorsed by Germany and France, who had partially brokered it, but a agreement which Ukraine sabotaged with the collusion of the Western powers. Well, they could have avoided this whole crisis had they worked towards implementation of the Minsk II agreement. Remember, the Minsk II agreement was an internal settlement of Ukraine's crisis. It didn't even require Ukraine to give up its aspiration to join NATO. And on the topic of NATO, when that situation was brought up in a serious way by the Russians last year and at the start of this year, well, again, the Western powers could have settled this whole conflict by simply saying that the decision to taken back in Budapest in 2008 to offer Ukraine NATO membership at some point in the future, that was clearly a mistake, and that there was no possibility that Ukraine would join NATO at all, and certainly not without full consultations and the agreement of the Russians. Had those decisions been taken, had the Minsk agreement been implemented, as all the European governments and the United States said that it should, had that obvious decision about NATO been made, Ukraine and NATO been made, we would not be in this mess. Now we see what the Russians are saying. We see what Sergei Ryabkov is saying. The Russians are saying, we will continue our military operation until we achieve all our objectives. We will decide ourselves when we think it's time to bring that operation to an end. And if the Ukrainians want to talk, we will talk to them, but we are not holding out for this. We no longer feel under any pressure to talk to them. The door, as I have said, is closing. The door of negotiations is closing, and we have brought this disaster upon ourselves. I can't help but think that in some time, in the not very distant future, the recriminations that we are seeing circulating around at the moment are going to look, frankly, like a pale early version of what is to come. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Remember, you can find us on other platforms like Locals and Rumble. And of course, if you join us on Rumble, on Locals, we will find that we do an extraordinary amount of exclusive material on Locals. I'm doing today, Wednesday, my exclusive Wednesday live stream on Locals. And of course, you can find us on other platforms as well, like the new free speech platform SuperU and ODYSEE and others. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And of course, you can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our polo shirts, our bomber jackets, our sweatshirts, all these great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.